In these perilous times, see from current events how biblical prophecy is coming to pass in front of our eyes. You're watching In the Last Days, the program that looks at Israel and the end times with teaching from a Hebraic perspective. With Martin and Natalie Blackham, thank you to our friends and partners who make this program possible. Now, here's Martin and Natalie.
Hi, welcome to the In the Last Days television program with myself, Martin Blackham. Natalie's behind the scenes today, so she can't be with us. We have a very special guest in the studio today, especially for you, Daniel Luria, originally from Melbourne, Australia, who is now the Executive Director of Atarat Kohanim. And great to have you with us, Daniel. So excited. We've seen you on the BBC film of the riots in Silwan and the building there, and it's great to have you. Welcome to the In the Last Days television program. The first thing I wanted to ask you was about what happened last night. We know there was a terrorist attack. I don't know how much that will be in the media today, but maybe your kind of reflections on what's happened over at Hebron.
Unfortunately, first of all, thank you for being here. Thank you for inviting me to the studio, and shalom to everyone who's watching this program. Unfortunately, we're part of it seems to be a never-ending nightmare. The Oslo, so to speak, peace accords has really been a war for the Jewish people. Some would call it a battle of survival. But one thing's for certain, it has failed miserably. And every so often, not just terrorism, but the Arabs who are amongst us and surrounding us rear the ugly head of trying to drive us into the sea. It expresses itself in all various ways. It's not just an issue of a few terrorists who are shooting at an innocent family driving along the road in Judea and Samaria. It goes far beyond that. There is a support system. There are families, neighbourhoods, communities. The whole of the Gaza Strip effectively has been deemed by the world even as a terrorist entity, Hamas and everything that entails. Even the Palestinian Authority, the Al-Aqsa Brigades. You know, some may wear a kafiyah, some may wear a suit and tie. Some may want to destroy the Jewish state in pieces quickly. We're surrounded by people that don't want us here. We basically have destroyed the pan-Arab dream, and having this Jewish state here on the land that God gave the Jewish people bothers millions of people. The world is going to have to understand that this particular son of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob and his children, have returned home. And they can try with shooting on the streets and Molotov cocktails and burning and suicide bombers. It can do everything under the sun to try, but we're here to stay. It's a tragedy for the family. The couple had 6 children, and they're now orphans. The other 2 people in the car were killed. Their lives have been cut short, and for what? Because there are Jews living in this part of the world. And when we have our own leaders, and when the leaders of the world recognise that it has nothing to do with land, it's not an issue of give a little bit extra land and everything will be okay. It's been tried and tested. It's not an issue of land. Having a Jewish homeland for Jewish people in this area, the Arab world in general does not want to accept. If someone wants to live with us in peace, then fine. But it shouldn't be at the expense of the tiniest of Jewish homelands. If the Arabs want to set up yet another Arab state, there's no shortage of Arab states around the world if they want to express themselves at a national level. Jordan is one possibility. There are no shortage of other Arab lands, but not at the expense of the tiny Jewish state. We can't afford to have a terrorist entity. It's bad enough as the way it is, with weapons, missiles, mortars on our back doorsteps because of what Oslo has brought to our doorstep. It has to stop.
Now, for people watching today, some of them won't understand what Oslo is. Maybe you could explain just briefly how it's affected Israel, the Oslo peace agreement.
Well, basically, Oslo has taken us back light years in relation to security, safety for Jewish people in the Jewish homeland. The concept was one, basically, of the left wing in Israel, and certain people in the centre, maybe even centre-right, even took on this concept that if we were to give land, part of the Jewish homeland, to the Arabs that are surrounding us, then basically there'd be peace. Unfortunately, it hasn't panned out that way. What it has ended up being is that Arabs that are living in the Gaza Strip, in Judea and Samaria, basically have become an entity called the so-called Palestinian people, even though nothing like this has ever existed. I mean, 70, 80 years ago, there was no Palestinian people. And if there was a nation called the Palestinian people, then theoretically you could say, well, where were they between 1948 to 1967? They could have created something for themselves, but there was no such thing. It doesn't exist. Oslo, in our stupidity basically, we have created this problem called the Palestinian people. 70% of Jordan citizens are Palestinian origin. The area of Palestine basically was really the Jewish national homeland that the world recognized. In fact, if we were living in the 1920s, 1921, basically what is today known as Israel and Jordan would have been the Jewish national home. And because of an agreement, 2/3 of that was given as Jordan to become the state of Jordan. The tiny Jewish homeland, what is today known as Israel and Judea and Samaria, was basically still called the Jewish national home. With this issue of having a lot of Arabs living in this area, not as many as the world thinks, but living in Judea and Samaria, I'm not going to pretend for a second that there aren't Arabs living in Judea and Samaria and the Gaza Strip. But the concept was, why don't we give them a state on our back doorstep? The problem is that it's the tiny Jewish homeland. The second problem is it's not enough anyway. They want more. They want Jerusalem. Many of them want to see us into the sea. I mean, Hamas, which is basically a huge entity in control of the Gaza Strip, and the citizens that live there don't want us anyway. So we have on our back doorstep, say, because of Oslo, that gave them weapons and various other rights, and now land, we have a terrorist entity on our back doorstep. And the world, for some reason, doesn't understand this. They haven't accepted it. On one hand, you've got the world, say America, France, England. What did they do? They went overseas thousands of kilometres. I say, sometimes I'm astounded by the hypocrisy of the world. Thousands of kilometres go overseas to bomb Iraq and Afghanistan in order to keep Arab fundamentalism and radical Islam thousands of kilometres away from their back doorsteps. And yet they expect the Jewish people to have a terrorist entity a few hundred metres away from the centre of Jerusalem, from the centres of Tel Aviv. We're not talking about thousands of kilometres, we're talking about a few hundred metres if you're talking about Jerusalem, or if you're talking about the back doorstep of Tel Aviv. It can't be. So Oslo basically gave, the attempt was by the left wing, let's give them land, that will give us peace. They got land, we got nothing but pieces of a treaty that didn't work. We got lots of terrorism, lots of hatred, and now it's on our back doorstep. It has been a nightmare and a tragedy, and some would even say it's been like a step backwards in what we would call the process of redemption. If the messianic donkey has been moving forward, the return of the Jewish people, the ingathering of the exiles, Oslo has meant that the messianic donkey has maybe sat down. And we have to move the process forward again and basically wake up the world.
And a lot of people watching may not understand the geography of, because Jerusalem, Hebron, the biblical cities, people may not understand this as they're watching today, but there's so much battle for these cities, isn't there? If you want to live in Tel Aviv, you can, no problem, but if you want to live in Hebron, if you want to live in Shechem, if you want to live in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, there's a battle for these strategic cities.
There's a certain amount of irony there also, because even from the Bible it's very strange. Even though the whole land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people, and there is no question about that, it's beyond the promise. There were actually 3 huge areas that not only did we rely on the promise, but were actually acquired by pure money, gold, silver, contract, the whole things. And they are Jerusalem, Hebron, and Shechem. And it's interesting that they are probably the 3 most volatile areas within this so-called battle over the existence of the Jewish state. There is a huge battle going over Jerusalem today, also Hebron and Shechem, but Shechem already, unfortunately, will have to, that's something else to be handled down the track, because the Oslo Accords has already given total control of Shechem over to the Arabs today. Thank God parts of Hebron haven't been, but there's still a battle in Hebron and primarily in Jerusalem. I mean, even the missiles, If you remember the missiles, unfortunately, that were landing in Gush Katif, that were landing in Ashdod and Ashkelon, thousands of missiles. This is something else I cannot fathom. I initially, this is from Australia, I can't even begin to try and understand how one missile could land in the middle of a town square. It couldn't exist. It couldn't be. Yet we as the Jewish people had to endure thousands upon thousands of missiles. We gave the land. We destroyed 10,000 people's lives. Uprooted people who were buried in cemeteries. Our land, our cities, our towns, everything that has been established was destroyed for the sake of peace, because the Arabs would then be okay with us. The result was thousands of missiles landing in regular cities. How could this be? How could it be? But what's interesting is that some of the missiles that were landing in Gush Katif, they had written on it Al-Quds, Jerusalem. For them, the battle is Jerusalem. Everything centers around the holy city. The world is going to have to understand that it's first of all, it's not possible to divide. It can't divide, and there's no reason why we should divide it. It belongs to the Jewish people. It's one of the minor cities for the Arab world. The Arabs have their back towards the Golden Dome in America. They face towards Mecca and Medina. This is, for the Jewish people, there is only one city. It belongs to the Jewish people. We are back home, and it will remain in the hands of the Jewish people. If they don't like it, then they can go to Mecca, you can go to Medina, or you can live comfortably under Jewish sovereignty in Jerusalem. Division of the city cannot be. It's impossible. It won't be, and we as the Jewish people, or the world at large that understands the connection to the Jewish people, to the land of Israel, and especially to Jerusalem, and especially to the heart of Jerusalem, which is the old city, the Temple Mount, the city of David, the Mount of Olives, the Old Yemen, all of these places are central to who we are as a people. And nothing can ever shake that bond. No matter how much terrorism, no matter how many Molotov cocktails and riots and demonstrations and demands, we have to tell the world, stop, to here. It's not going on any further.
Now, in your job, you moved from Melbourne, Australia, that's right, for being the executive director of the organisation.
Ateret Kohanim.
Yes, Ateret Kohanim, and or the Jerusalem Reclamation project.
Basically, the work that we're doing in Reclamation is bringing back Jewish life that centres around educational institutes. There are people around the world that would like to own a piece of the rock. They want to own a part of, not of the Temple Mount, of course, that's in the hands of God and the Messiah. But the area around, the physical redemption, want to own a piece of the old city, the Mount of Olives, the Yemenite village, etc. They basically buy, it's in their name, not through the organisation whatsoever. And we would basically at some point either add yeshiva students, centres of Jewish learning, for married men, for not married men. There are play centres, nurseries, and Jewish life always centred around some type of biblical or Torah educational institute moves into these places, which is why today, for example, the old Jewish quarter, some people refer to as the Muslim quarter, but that's because the world doesn't know anything about basic history. I mean, less than 150 years ago, there was a Jewish majority in the whole of Jerusalem, which was just then the old city. The Muslim quarter of today.
So how long ago was that?
Some say 1840, some say 1870. And this is not propaganda. It happens to be Turkish census. A Jewish majority of the old city. The total population of, say, 28, 29,000 and 19,500 Jews. The Muslim quarter of today, that was actually something that the British actually did, was the main hub of Jewish activity. 21 synagogues, 6 centres of Jewish learning in what is today known as the Muslim quarter. But because of the pogroms and the riots that took place in the 1920s and 1930s, and the Jews were kicked out totally in 1948, it became zero.
So people watching may not understand about these pogroms. Can you give them a bit of background, what happened? Or?
Well,
so the Jewish people were living in all of Jerusalem.
Correct.
Which was the old city, really, and
right.
a bit in the outskirts, like where we are today. But what happened? Did the Arabs say the Jews had to leave Jerusalem, or?
Basically, there's been a revival of Jewish life the last 200-300 years. There's been a constant Jewish presence in Jerusalem ever since the destruction of the temple for 2,000 years. No one's going to say that there was a Jewish majority. Maybe there wasn't. Most of Israel, or the Promised Land, was either desert, Nothing really came of it. There's been various conquerors over the years, all the way back from the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Muslims, the Crusaders, the Turks and the British. All various conquerors. Throughout this whole period, Jews have tried to come back. Kicked out, back, kicked out, come back. We've been basically in exile for thousands of years. Around 200 years ago, there was another surge and the revival of Jewish life into Jerusalem when it was then occupied by the Turkish rulers. It was part of the Turkish Empire. By 1840, some say 1870, according to a Turkish census, there was a Jewish majority inside the Old City. Remember, in those years, the whole of Jerusalem was just the Old City. Only from 1860 onwards did they start to build outside the city walls. A Jewish majority. As a result of Jerusalem being built up and thriving, basically Arabs also lived in there. I'm not going to pretend for a second there weren't Arabs also that were living here and that they also came back as a result of this Jewish revival. But of course the local Arabs did not want to see this revival of Jerusalem, or at least not under Jewish control. Or once it became this nationalistic fervour, once there was this desire to once again re-establish a Jewish homeland, the Arab world said no. In fact, there was the Mufti of Jerusalem, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He was very heavily connected to the Nazis. In fact, first of all, he was wanted by the British. He incited the pogroms in 1920. Incited the pogroms in 1928-29.
You might not know this, but watching today, we've got Daniel Luria in the studio with us. If you've just tuned in, but they might not realise that the Grand Mufti, I think, didn't he go to Berlin to meet with Hitler?
Yes, he was. Once he ran from here, once he incited, he was responsible for the murder of tens, if not hundreds, of Jews, responsible for these pogroms and riots. He then runs away, flees the country, and of course he gets safe haven under the Nazis. And there's pictures about him and Hitler and Eichmann and Himmler. He basically then established, and most of the world doesn't even realise this, he established the first and only Muslim Nazi SS unit called the Hanjar. Some call it the Sanjar, the Hanjar, and that wiped out 90% of Yugoslavian Jewry. He established, there was a radio station, Voice of Palestine, to incite the Arabs, stopping the Jews from coming back into the land of Israel, making sure that there would never be the establishment of the Jewish state. Did everything possible. What's interesting, of course, is today his private residence was acquired many years ago by some Jewish concerns, and in the place that he used to live is a beautiful finale, basically, is that his old residence will be the house of either a yeshiva or 21 families, I think, are going to be moving into his old residence. The world can try and destroy the Jewish people, but at the end of the day, we're the ones that are here. You can have Nazi sympathisers like the Grand Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, but at the end of the day, we're the ones that are here in Jerusalem building in his old residence. There are now going to be Jewish life, Jewish children running around. The world can try and do everything possible to stop the Messianic process and to stop the Jewish people returning to this land. But the message is very clear. In gathering the exiles, on wings of eagles, call it a Qantas, call it El Al. Clearly it's El Al, the wings of eagles. The deserts have bloomed, whether we like it or not. We are back here, and we aren't going anywhere. And they can try, and there can be the Oslo failure, there can be anything under the sun. There can be pogroms 70 years ago, and even riots today, and even murders on the streets. We're here. Jerusalem belongs to the Jewish people, as does Hebron and Judea and Samaria, and maybe mistakes have been made. I hope that the leaders of today understand who we're dealing with. You can be a leader, Palestinian or Arab leader, with a kafiyah and say very clearly what you want, or you can be someone that speaks English with a suit and tie and very cleverly try and destroy the Jewish state or deny the Holocaust. The point is that we have to stand up to the world and say, stop. Understand that Oslo peace accords have failed. I'm happy to live in peace with anyone around me. I want to be like maybe Australia, New Zealand, Canada and America. Let's live in peace with the Arabs. But it doesn't mean that I have to give away my lands, my mother, my grandmother, my family. No, it ain't going to happen. It shouldn't happen. There's no reason for it to happen because this is the Jewish homeland that belongs to the Jewish people. You don't like it, then leave.
And your organisation is helping people buy houses, is that right? Or?
Well, part of the organisation, we actually don't acquire the houses ourselves, obviously. Okay. It's acquired by individuals or foundations, either in Israel or abroad. It's in their name. It's not. Our organisation is primarily part of the educational side of things, the touristy side of things. We have play centres, nurseries, centres of Jewish learning, yeshivot, so that may go into places that are owned by individuals around the world that buy directly through either the United Jerusalem Investment Fund that we're related to. But we ourselves, as an organisation, not the American Friends of a Torah Kohanim, not the Friends of a Torah Kohanim in England or Europe or in France, it doesn't go through the organisation. Individuals buy, invest in their name. We are involved because we want the revival of Jewish life. We want to make it happen. We make sure there's a yeshiva there and families and students. And thank God there's been an enormous revival. Today, in the Muslim quarter of today, the old Jewish quarter, there's close to 1,000 Jews now living.
Now, we were in one of the houses there, which has been acquired, and you were talking to us. And how easy is it practically, because what's happening, and maybe I ought to explain a little bit about this, but what's happening is the Jewish people are moving back, and Daniel's brought us a map today, back into places they used to live before the pogroms, back into places which they lived for hundreds of years and had to leave because of the riots. Now, how easy is it practically for them to buy a house? Because, I mean, we've heard stories that, you know, that the Arabs deny it, or they, like, for example, in Hebron, they deny that they've sold anything, or that they have to leave the country. How true is that?
Well, let's put it this way. Obviously, there's some things I can't even talk to you about or speak to hundreds of thousands or millions of people that may be watching this. But basically, there is enormous pressure on the Arabs not to sell. The Arabs themselves, between the Waqf, the Morocco, and various other Arab countries, have even set up their own Jerusalem Investment Fund in order to divide the city, adding Arab facts on the ground to divide the city. So there is a battle over every centimetre in the heart of Jerusalem. There's pressure on Arabs not to sell. In fact, Arabs, strangely enough, can be killed if they sell. That itself is absurd. I mean, I come from
that's other Arabs who would kill them?
Yeah.
Because they've gone into...
It's very clear. It's a written law. It's not like a hidden byline in some distant religious Muslim book. No, it's an open fatwa, a law. An Arab sells to a Jew, whether it be in Jerusalem or other places, he can be killed. And therefore, one has to be very careful when dealing with the Arabs. But then, of course, that also means that you have to go to enormous extents and levels to protect the Arab that is selling. Whether he is maybe moved overseas, whether there are court cases, everything that may be done, whether, of course he has to deny it, but maybe that's maybe, I'm not going to say anything specific, I'm not going to do any specific examples, whether it be in Hebron or in Yerushalayim. But if you understand the overall picture, that there is this pressure, and therefore things have to be said and done during and after the sale in order to protect the Arab, then okay, he has to say what he has to say. It's not straightforward. But thank God, there's no shortage of Arabs ready to sell. You have to remember, though, in the old city especially, and also in the Yemenite village, that is today known as Silwan, for example, there are Arabs living in old Jewish buildings. They don't have the title, the deed to the place to say, I, Muhammad or Mustafa, own the place. No. You have to remember that many of the buildings, they are just protected tenants. At some point, the protected tenancy runs out. Either they pass on or the children don't live with them, and then automatically it's meant to revert back to the Jewish people. I mean, there's for example, there are synagogues inside the old city, old yeshivot that Arabs today are using as a dining room and a toilet for their own homes. I ask myself, where in the world would this happen? Could you imagine for a second if I, Daniel Luria, was living in a 70-year-old mosque in the middle of some Arab country? How long would I last? A week? A month? I probably wouldn't last 24 hours. For 70 years, there are Arabs today, to this very day, living in old synagogues in the Mount of Olives, the Yemenite village, in the old city. It's something that shouldn't be. Now, once again, I'm not saying, God forbid, that the Arabs can't stay here. For sure, Arabs can stay. In fact, Jews and Arabs can live together. We're, in fact, probably the only organisation today involved in some type of at least basic coexistence. You see, the left wing in Israel, whether we like it or not, has been effectively decimated. People have woken up to the reality of the Arab world and the failed peace process. There's a very small left-wing group today in Israel, and there's even a smaller extreme left-wing group in Israel. Sometimes they're loud. Sometimes they get their message across because some newspapers are very leaning to the left. But basically, they're ideologically bankrupt. Today, most of them are talking about separation. At least in the case scenario that we're talking about, Jews and Arabs can live together inside the Old City under, of course, Jewish sovereignty. I mean, this is the Jewish homeland, the Jewish state. And Arabs and Jews can live together, sometimes in the same courtyard. So, yes, there are Arabs ready to sell, and we obviously need many people who are ready to buy. Obviously, if there were many more Jewish investors to buy, or people around the world that understood the importance of this, or the area around this, because this, of course, is a latter stage in this process of redemption. One has to respect what's there today. Today there is a Golden Dome. Today there is Al-Aqsa. That doesn't mean to say that Jews shouldn't have rights or dreams or beliefs what will be there. The fact that, and that's another whole issue altogether, is the Temple Mount. I don't want to go down that path because I get too... it's an emotional topic. It's a problematic topic. The fact that the Arabs are destroying things from the Second Temple period, basically wiping out any semblance of the Jewish history and our roots there by creating a mosque underground in the catacombs that existed in the Second Temple period, dumping over 100 truckloads outside the Old City, denying that there was even, and trying to wipe out basically Jewish history, and at the same time threatening violence if a Jew, or even a Christian, if a Jew or Christian opens his mouth on the Temple Mount today, when he's allowed to go up there after very strict and sometimes crazy security, he can't take up a prayer book, he can't take up a Bible, and if he thinks of even saying a prayer, he can be thrown off. Why? Because the Arabs have threatened violence if that happens. We're living in a twisted world sometimes. But okay, all in good time. We today are dealing with the physical redemption, the revival of Jewish life outside the Temple Mount. And Jews have gone back to the old Yemenite village that I think some people call Silwan. Jews have gone back to the old Shimon the Just neighborhood, which some people called Sheikh Jarrah. There are now Jews living on the Mount of Olives. That is unbelievable. That neighborhood there, every time I think about it, it just brings a smile to my face. You have a neighborhood on the Mount of Olives.
We've run out of time, Daniel. It's been fantastic. If you've just tuned in, you're going to have to watch the program to see Daniel. It's been great to be with you, and remember, we're living in the last days.
You've been watching In the Last Days, a TV program with Martin and Natalie Blackham, the program that looks at Israel and the end times with teaching from a Hebraic perspective. If you would like to financially support the program or find out about conferences, meetings or ministry products, then please contact us with the details on your screen. Visit our easy-to-use website at www.inthelastdays.com and register for our free e-newsletter. Get the latest news from Israel, product information, online video teaching, or watch today's TV program at a time that's convenient to you. Thank you again, friends and partners, for making this program possible.
See you in 2 weeks, same time, same station, for the next program from In the Last Days.